Hi and welcome back. This is lesson number 7. Congratulations, you now know how to act. Next, you'll learn how to act fast. FAST standing for find, assess and analyze, select and translate information in the sources that you've collected to be able to answer your questions. And we'll do this letter by letter, step by step. So let's start with F. At this point, you should have a lot, if not all of your sources collected. I suggest that as you collect them, you put them in a folder. So you should have these already, and you should already have your questions or your legal theory, and maybe you'll have a really good grasp of context too. To now find the information you need, you should do two things. First, when reading any source, ask, what statements and paragraphs help me answer the questions or corroborate the legal theory? So clearly you have to now read through the sources and have this question in mind. The second thing you can do, which might be very useful, is to search within the sources. If they're PDFs or Word documents, preferably they're PDFs, search for keywords separately or in different combinations. And I've developed a kind of search logic to do this, which I find useful, and I'd like to share that with you. So this is the search logic I use. Each column, there are 4 columns, as you can see. Each column represents a type of key term that you can search to find relevant information. So starting from the left, we have the applicant's the name of the applicant's social, ethnic, racial group, and so on. And here are some examples that I put in there. And then moving to the right, we have the location name. So that can be a country, a city, a town, a village, a district, a municipality. And then to the right of that, we have key terms for persecution. There's some examples there. And finally, we have terms for the government's inability or unwillingness to protect. One thing to note about spelling, sometimes names can be spelled differently, so see if that's the case, and if it is, search using the different spellings commonly used. I included the example of the Maya group Quiche, which has 2 different spellings. Sorry, that should be 2. But so you want to make sure that you actually search for both those terms. Because some sources might use one while others will use the other. And you can search for these terms individually or in different combinations. You can search for them in the sources themselves, or you can actually search or do a Google search using these terms to help you find sources. It's a little bit of a trial and error process, but I can promise you, if you keep trying, you will get good information. You will find really good information, and if you end up not finding it, I think you can take comfort in knowing that you used a really good technique. So again, let me try to make this a little more real by showing you how I apply the search logic in the case of Jay from Cameroon. Of course, from the questions and the legal theory, I had plenty of terms to look for. Broken down into the columns, this is what it looked like by way of example. I'm not putting in everything that I used, but I'm just putting in a few terms to show you what to show you the process. And I also tried different combinations of these terms. There's really no need to look at them closely. They're in the research guide. This is just to give you a concrete example of my own work and how this actually is highly applicable in practice. Okay, so we have F done. We've found a lot, let's say, we've found quite a lot of sentences, paragraphs or more that seem to fit the bill. They seem to be answering our questions. Practically, it can help already if you have a draft document where all your questions or theories are listed as headings. And as you find info in the sources, cut and paste them under the appropriate question. And of course, cite the sources so you know where the information comes from. This will save you a lot of time down the road. In any case, what we now want to do is assess and analyze what we found. And there's really three things to think about here. First, make sure the source is reliable. In practice, this means that avoiding sources which are clearly ideologically driven, sources that don't cite their own sources or that just don't seem to be written by knowledgeable people or experts, or sources that are considered by the US government to have the wrong agendas, so say Russian or Chinese backed news media. Second, make sure the sources are consistent internally and there's consistency between sources. For example, I've noticed that you can use a source, one source, same source, which supports one of the applicant's claims, but not another. And it can be easy to miss that type of inconsistency. So that's why it's important to look for that. And you look for that by just paying attention as you read, and you try to read the whole document. Three, make sure there's no potentially harmful information to your client in the sources. And if there is, see if you can mitigate it. So I want to give you an example of how to do that. So one thing to note is that sometimes information only looks harmful, but upon closer look isn't. So just make sure you understand what it says. A source may, for example, say that a general ethnic group isn't persecuted in general, but somewhere there might be a statement buried in the notes or a short sentence saying something like that your client's subgroup or region is an exception to this rule, right? So that in that case, the information only looks harmful, but it isn't in this specific instance of your client. In any case, where you find something that looks iffy, something that looks off, something that just does contradict your client's claims, you really should acknowledge it and you should explain it when you excerpt from that source in your index. I've heard from a lot of immigration judges directly that this is what they want to see. They want to see you acknowledge it because they will see the problematic statements, and so will potentially an asylum officer. So you want to make sure they can't use them against your client, and you want to make sure that you're mitigating the information as much as possible. Now, I didn't have issues of this kind in the case of Jay from Cameroon, but I did have something like this issue in another case I worked on. It was an LGBTQ plus case, and here one report stated that discrimination against lesbians was widespread in this country in one paragraph, but I read the whole report, including a methodological appendix. Apologies, I forgot to mention that the report stated that discrimination was widespread in the country except in the applicant's region. So that was clearly a problem. But I read the whole report, and it had a methodological appendix, and within that appendix there were notes, and in one of those notes the report said that it was severely limited in scope, and that it doesn't preclude there being far more discrimination than found in the study, right? So it didn't actually say there was no discrimination in the applicant's region. That would have been a real problem. Instead, it said the data was limited. Well, the other data I collected in this case was very comprehensive, and it covered the applicant's region. So those data gaps in the report that was problematic were filled by those other sources, meaning there was in the end no harmful information and no inconsistency between the sources. So that's how you go about analyzing and assessing the information. So, okay, we've collected our sources, we've assessed and analyzed them, and we've probably already pulled out or started pulling out a lot of text from our sources and pasting them into our draft index. Now what we want to do is really focus on, yes, selecting the best quotes or the most relevant quotes that will support the individual claims. When I select, I think about a number of things, which I'm suggesting that you do too. So you want to select sentences, paragraphs, or several paragraphs that are concrete, meaning they mention specific details such as dates, locations, specific ethnicities, forms of violence, etc., that are most relevant to the applicant's claims. You want to select quotes that are clear, meaning they're written in plain and accessible English with no or minimal jargon. And if there is jargon and you think it's useful, it's good to provide a note explaining that to the adjudicator in plain language. Wherever possible, you want to select information from several different types of sources. Again, to show that the applicant's statements are verified in sources independent from each other. Finally, don't overdo it. Try to minimize the page numbers of the sources and the index for that matter. If a report is over 30 pages or a document is over 30 pages, I just save and print the sections that are relevant to the case. And I wouldn't over excerpt from the sources. Only excerpt the statements that really answer your questions. So here's a brief example of how I selected some sources and excerpts in the case of Jay. One of the questions I had in that case, let's remember, is the following. Are opposition parties persecuted in Cameroon? And I had specific dates and locations for when the applicant was protesting. So I looked, I read the sources, I searched the sources using the search logic above, and I found excerpts from several types of sources that were concrete and clear in their descriptions of how the government goes after the opposition. And here you can see some of those examples. You can also take a closer look if you read the research guide. So I'll just skip reading them out loud here, and I'll move on. Okay, so now we've come to the last letter, which is T, which stands for translate. Translate the relevant information in the sources. Translation here means two things. First, and of course you know this, some of the sources, some of the best sources in certain cases, may be in a different language, like Spanish or French. If you can, you want to, of course, translate those if they are relevant. Second, and this might sometimes be more useful, you may need to quote-unquote translate certain terms that are in English to really let the strength of the claim sink into the adjudicator's mind. I wouldn't assume the adjudicators have studied political science, modern history, anthropology, and so on. And a lot of important terms in the sources actually come from this research. For example, authoritarian government is a term people have probably heard about, but when asked what it means, I think you'll get a lot of answers. And I wouldn't assume adjudicators really know what it means. So the first time you mention a term like that, it may be useful to look it up in a scholarly dictionary and define it. In this case, you get this definition in a really good dictionary. I quote, authoritarianism is a style of government in which the rulers demand unquestioning obedience from the ruled. And just by having this definition, I feel I really clarify the context of the applicant's claims in his or her favor. And that's it. That's the act fast method. Like anything, mastering it is a matter of application, practice, and continued reflection on how you can use it effectively in your context and how you can address issues as they come up. As you do your research following the method, one little prompt I find useful is to ask myself, did I act fast? Did I cover all the letters, all the steps? That doesn't mean following them slavishly, but it does mean being mindful that they're there to support you. And even though you may not need to consciously follow each step, it's really good to know you have these options. Okay, you can now move on to the next lesson.